Good evening from New York. I'm John Hayden. We have some big breaking news. There are rooms that history walks into uninvited. Rooms where something happens that nobody planned, nobody staged, and nobody could have scripted. Something that arrives through the collision of the right person, the right moment, and the right three words. Brussels was that room. A press hall packed with more than 200 journalists, diplomats, trade analysts, and European Union officials. Professionals trained to remain neutral, to observe without reacting, to write and not feel. And yet, when those three words landed, every single one of them stood up. Not out of courtesy, not out of protocol, out of the involuntary recognition that they had just witnessed something that does not happen in rooms like this. Something that cannot be manufactured, rehearsed, or repeated. Within 6 hours, the clip had crossed 120 million views. The BBC ran it as the lead international story. The Financial Times published a 3,500-word analysis arguing that what happened in that press hall had done more for Canada's international standing than 18 months of formal trade policy. But it is the three words themselves, three words delivered with such absolute stillness that they landed like a controlled detonation that tell you everything about where this confrontation is heading. To understand why three words produced that eruption, you need to understand everything that came before them. Mark Carney arrived in Brussels for a three-day economic summit with European Union leaders, the culmination of months of Canadian diplomatic outreach aimed at building trade partnerships and security relationships that would reduce Canada's dependence on the United States. The summit itself had been productive. New frameworks, expanded cooperation agreements, the foundation of what both sides were already calling the transatlantic bridge between Canada and Europe. But the press conference that followed the closing session was a different animal entirely. The room was packed with reporters who had spent the summit period not covering the agreements, but sharpening the skeptical angles they intended to deploy. Journalists from across Europe, the United Kingdom, Asia, and North America. Veterans of international press conferences who had seen every form of diplomatic deflection, every rehearsed pivot, every polished non-answer wrapped in the language of commitment and partnership. These were not partisan attackers. They were professionals carrying real doubts, doubts that had been building for months across European capitals. Was Canada overplaying its hand? Was Carney's confrontational approach damaging the global economy? Was a country of 40 million people genuinely capable of sustaining a trade confrontation against a country of 340 million? The room was not on Carney's side. The room was waiting to be convinced. And the reporters had brought questions designed to make convincing them impossible. The first question came from a senior correspondent at a major European news agency. She stood, identified herself, and delivered what was less a question than a structured indictment. Canada had spent 18 months escalating a trade confrontation that had disrupted global supply chains, increased costs for consumers on both sides of the Atlantic, and created uncertainty in markets worldwide. European businesses were reporting increased costs as a direct result of the instability. At what point, she asked, does Canada accept responsibility for the economic damage its confrontational approach is causing to the rest of the world? The trap was elegant and airtight. Either answer, yes, we accept responsibility, or no, it is not our fault, would generate a damaging headline. Carney paused. Not a long pause, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Enough to signal that he had heard the question fully and was choosing his response rather than reacting to it. Then he leaned into the microphone and said something that made every notebook in the room open at the same moment. He said he wanted to address the premise before he addressed the conclusion, because the premise was doing a lot of work in that question. The phrase landed like a scalpel. He continued without rushing. Canada did not impose the first tariff, not the second, not the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, or the seventh. Every single tariff in this confrontation was initiated by the United States. Canada responded. The distinction between initiating and responding, he said, is not semantic. It is the entire question of responsibility. If your house is on fire because your neighbor set it on fire, the question of when you accept responsibility for the smoke is directed at the wrong house. A Reuters correspondent typed the analogy into her phone before he had finished the sentence. The room had shifted, not toward him yet, but toward attention. The second question, though, was built from harder material. The German financial journalist who stood next had done his homework with clinical precision. The United States represents 75% of Canadian exports. Canada represents less than 18% of American exports. The mathematical reality, he argued, is that the United States can absorb the loss of Canadian trade far more easily than Canada can absorb the loss of American trade. How, given this fundamental asymmetry, could Carney justify telling the Canadian people that this was a confrontation Canada could sustain, let alone win? The numbers were real. 75% is 75%. Any diplomatic reassurance would have sounded hollow against the weight of that arithmetic. Carney did not offer reassurance, he offered arithmetic of his own. He acknowledged the 75% directly, then delivered 6 statistics without notes, without hesitation, without a single glance at a briefing paper. Canada supplies 60% of America's crude oil imports, 98% of electricity imports in American border states, 73% of the potash that American agriculture depends on for fertilizer, 81% of the softwood lumber that American home builders use, 67% of the nickel the American defense industry requires for advanced weapon systems, 100% of the fresh water flowing into the Great Lakes industrial basin. Then he stopped, let the numbers settle, and said the thing that made the room audibly shift. America is 75% of Canadian exports, but Canada is 100% of American supply in categories where there is no alternative supplier, no alternative source, and no alternative timeline shorter than a decade. Asymmetry, he said, is not measured by volume, it is measured by replaceability. They can replace the Canadian market. They cannot replace Canadian resources. Those are different kinds of asymmetry, and one of them is significantly more dangerous than the other. The German reporter sat down without a follow-up. Scattered applause broke out in the middle rows, highly unusual for Brussels, where decorum typically prohibits any audience reaction. The third reporter abandoned data entirely and tried something more dangerous, something personal. The British correspondent who stood was a veteran of international political coverage, known for questions designed to knock leaders off their scripts and into unguarded territory. She smiled and asked Carney what he would say to critics who described him as a former central banker who had gotten lucky in politics and was now in over his head, playing geopolitical chess against the most powerful nation on earth with a country that most Americans could not find on a map. The question was precise in its cruelty. Defensiveness looks weak. Arrogance looks delusional. Rehearsed humility sounds hollow. Most leaders faced with this framing either attack the premise, ignore it, or deliver a scripted line about being focused on serving their country. Carney did none of these. He smiled, a genuine smile, not a political one, and said that the former central banker detail was actually relevant experience. He had run the Bank of Canada during a global financial crisis, then the Bank of England during Brexit. His entire career had been spent walking into rooms where everything was on fire and being expected to stay calm and make good decisions under pressure. So when people said he was a banker playing at politics, he would suggest that the current situation, a global trade crisis requiring someone who could remain calm, read data, and decide under pressure, might be precisely the moment where a banker was exactly what was needed. The room laughed. Not nervously, not politely, The genuine, surprised, delighted laughter of people who expected defensiveness and received wit carrying substance underneath it. He waited for it to subside, still smiling, and added that he had watched a lot of boxing. The smaller fighter wins more often than people expect, especially when the bigger fighter keeps swinging at air. The second laugh was louder. The British journalist who had asked the question was laughing herself. That image, the correspondent visibly appreciating the answer to her own hostile question, became the most shared photograph of the entire summit. And then the American journalist stood up, and the room knew. The Washington bureau chief from one of the most prominent American newspapers had waited. His posture alone communicated the weight of what he was about to ask. He looked at Carney and said, with the gravity of someone who understood the stakes precisely, that the performance today had been impressive, but he had to ask the question nobody in the room had asked directly. Can Canada actually win this? Not manage it, not survive it, not make the best of it. Win against the United States of America. Can a country of 40 million people actually win a trade war against the most powerful economy in the history of the world? The room went absolutely still. The question hung in the air like a held breath. It was the only question that ultimately mattered. Everything else, the reframes, the data, the wit, had been prelude. This was the destination. Carney looked at the American journalist. His expression shifted. The charm was gone. The humor was gone. The diplomatic warmth was gone. What replaced them was something quieter and more powerful. The settled, still confidence of a man who knows the answer before the question is finished and has been waiting for someone to finally ask it. He leaned into the microphone. 3 words. We already are. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. Then the room detonated. Not applause, something before applause, something roar, a collective intake of breath that became a roar. 200 professionals on their feet applauding with an intensity that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the visceral recognition of a perfect moment. The 3 words worked not because they were clever, but because 40 minutes of architecture had made them inevitable. Each reply had been a step on a staircase, and the final step had placed Carney at a height from which the answer was not an argument, but a statement of observable fact. The American journalist sat down. He did not follow up. He did not challenge. He wrote 1 word in his notebook. Reporters who saw it later said the word was masterful. The world responded with a speed and unanimity that surprised even the journalists who had been in the room. The BBC ran the 4 replies in sequence under a chyron that read 4 questions, 4 answers, 1 eruption. CNN devoted a full panel segment to analyzing each reply individually. The Economist published a piece arguing that the Brussels performance had shifted international perception of the confrontation more decisively than any tariff, any retaliation, or any trade agreement combined, because it had given the world a visual, undeniable demonstration of which leader was operating from composure and which was operating from chaos. The polling that followed was extraordinary. International favorability toward Canada rose 12 points across European nations within a week. Favorability toward the United States dropped 8. Among European business leaders, the demographic that determines actual trade flows and investment decisions, the shift was more dramatic still. 71% reported greater confidence in Canada as a trade partner after watching the Brussels coverage. 63% reported diminished confidence in the United States. The Canadian dollar strengthened against the American dollar for the first time in 3 months, a movement that currency analysts attributed not to any policy change, but to what one Bank of America strategist called a confidence repricing based on perceived leadership quality. Foreign direct investment inquiries to Canadian trade offices increased 42% in the 2 weeks following Brussels. 3 multinational corporations announced they had shortlisted Canadian locations over American alternatives, with one CEO explicitly citing political stability and leadership predictability as a deciding factor. Composure had been translated directly into capital, into currency movements, into boardroom decisions made by executives who had watched the same 4 minutes as everyone else and drawn the same conclusion about which country was being led by someone they could trust to remain rational under pressure. Here is what Brussels actually proved, and why it matters far beyond the politics of one trade confrontation between 2 neighboring countries. There are 2 ways to lead. One tries to dominate through volume, through aggression, through the performance of strength that refuses to acknowledge doubt. It mistakes noise for power and mistakes composure for weakness. The other leads through something quieter and far more difficult: the willingness to answer, to think in public, to let the quality of the reasoning carry the weight that lesser leaders try to carry through the weight of their voices. One tries to win by making the room afraid. The other wins by making the room understand. And in a world exhausted by performance, saturated with leaders who mistake rage for resolve and insult for authority, what happened in Brussels was not just a press conference. It was a proof of concept. It was evidence, real, measurable, economically consequential evidence that composure is not just more dignified than aggression, it is more effective. It moves currency markets. It shifts business investment. It realigns continental sentiment. It produces 3 words that 200 trained professionals cannot sit still for. The question that should stay with you, the question that extends beyond Canada, beyond Brussels, beyond this particular confrontation is this: what would it look like if your leader could actually answer? Not deflect, not attack, not perform, answer. Because what Mark Carney demonstrated in that room was not a political technique, it was a principle. The principle that mastery, genuine mastery, never needs to announce itself. It only needs to show up, stay calm, and let the evidence accumulate until 3 words become the only possible conclusion. We already are. Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment. A really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.